Hi folks, welcome to my wrap up for the midpoint in 2025. This year so far, including a few books that I read at the very end of last year, but after the cut-off for my end of 2024 video, I have read or attempted to read, there are a couple of DNFs that we'll talk about in a minute, 87 science fiction books, old and new, since that time. So it's been a pretty good half year so far, obviously different shapes and sizes, some books bigger than others. Some vital statistics first. There were no car crashes, no ones, twos, threes or fours. There was 1 5 out of 10. There were 6 out of 10 I gave 10 times. Most of the scores were 7s or 8s. There were 60 of those. There were 11 that got a 9 or 9.5 out of 10, and then only one book, and we'll talk about that in a bit, that got a 10 out of 10. And then there were 2 DNFs. But let's start with the 2 that I DNF'd. I don't DNF many books. I probably don't DNF enough books. Actually, I should probably DNF more. But the 2 that I gave up with were Sinners by Pat Cadigan, which is a sort of cyberpunk book, and I got about 150 pages, maybe a little bit more into this, and essentially gave up. I found, and this is not an uncommon experience I gather with this book, I just found it too confusing. There were too many similar characters, the plot thread wasn't obvious. I think if I'd waited another 50 pages maybe it would have started to become obvious. But really, I just didn't get on with it at all, and I put it down. So I'm not saying, never say never. I'm not kicking it into the long grass or anything. It's still on my shelves, and I may well go back to it some stage when I'm feeling like I can gird my loins sufficiently to get past the first 150 pages again. Sadly, it didn't work for me. I'll probably lose a bit of serious science fiction street cred next. But the other book that I've DNF'd this year so far is Hard to Be a God by the Strugatsky brothers, of course, the authors of, amongst other things, Roadside Picnic. And I got about halfway into this and lost the will to live. I got bored. I didn't see the point of it. I couldn't really tell where it was going. And I think I probably suffered from the translation not being ideal. If I remember rightly, this was translated from Russian to German, or maybe French, and then from German or maybe French to English. And I think it suffered from those couple of hops. And more recent editions, I gather, have been translated directly from the original Russian into English, and apparently that makes a difference. I have been tempted, if I'm completely honest, to sell this book because it's worth a pretty penny. It's a UK first edition, and they're pretty hard to come by. I found it in a charity shop, so I would certainly clean up. I could probably sell it for around 100, maybe even a little bit more pounds. But I like it as a book, as a thing from a collection point of view, so I should probably keep it, and maybe I'll try it again once at one time if I'm feeling a bit braver. So those are my 2 abject failures for the year where I couldn't face finishing it. Right, what else have we got? So let's do most disappointing books. So these there weren't any real stinkers, DNFs aside, there weren't any real stinkers in the first half of the year. There were a few where I gave them sort of 3 out of 5 or 6 out of 10 kind of scores, middle of the road. Didn't really meet my expectations, and there was one in particular that was pretty bad that I gave a 5 out of 10. It was sort of heading into cosmic catastrophe territory there, and that was I don't even have it anymore. I've given it to charity. That's how much I thought of it. Is Paul Anderson's The Avatar, and there were a couple of major sins that were committed in that book. One was the length of it. It was about twice as long as it needed to be. I think, if I remember right, it was over 400 pages, maybe even near 500, and it could have been better served by being 250 maybe at most, and also. Which got jarring for me. I'm not Irish or anything, but the Irish accent for the female protagonist or love interest, I don't know what she is really, in that book. While she sounded beautiful as a character, her voice was awful. The voice that Anderson gave her sounded like it just completely mangled the Irish accent, and that just began to annoy me greatly. And so I did finish it. It was just a big fat meh overall, really. And considering it's the same guy that wrote Town Zero, which I quite enjoyed, and there are a few others of his that come recommended, that one just did not work for me at all. Right, what else we got here? Another book that I don't possess anymore, I gave it to charity, is Bone Shaker by Cherry Priest, which is on the Broderick and De Filippo 101 best novels list. I don't know what they were thinking when they chose that. Its main crime was that it was boring. I never really felt... So this is a... sort of steampunk version of Seattle with added zombies, kind of. There's been some sort of underground tunneling gone on in the gold rush sort of era in the 1800s, and it's released some sort of foul gas from under the surface, and that foul gas, as well as being sort of poisonous, will also turn you into a zombie or something like that. The Walking Dead, essentially. And then so it doesn't never really explain how, but a wall is hurriedly built around Seattle, and the remaining population kind of hemmed in to survive as best they can. And then there's a young lad whose father may or may not still be alive, or may not have had something to do with the release of the gas in the first place, who's super curious, and he finds his way in, and his mother has to go and rescue him. Essentially, that's the story. My big problem with it was I never really felt like there was any real jeopardy. You just knew that they were going to be all right, despite there being some sort of fairly high energy chases and things like that. So it was. It felt a little bit young adult to me, actually, which isn't a grave sin in its own, by itself. But I read, enough YA over the years. But I was even a YA at one point, believe it or not. But it's a dim and distant memory now. So that one didn't work for me either, really. So that's probably another disappointment. And then the last one, which I kind of was a bit trepidatious about when I picked it up, was Greg Egan's Shield's Ladder, which is notoriously one of his least accessible works. Is the mic on? Yeah, I think it is. One of his least accessible works. Despite having a science-based degree from, albeit many years ago, in theory I ought to have been able to follow what was going on, but it was way above my head. I think I needed a PhD, and the science or maths really of it left me cold and got in the way of the story. I think there was a story in there trying to get out somewhere, but the frankly too clever by half, complicated stuff kind of got in the way. So that didn't work for me at all. I read a couple of his other things, short stories of his that I really enjoyed, and Quarantine, which was again a little bit difficult, but was at least could follow it. To this day I couldn't explain what that was about. So those are the most disappointing reads of this year so far. So nothing tragic or no real kind of car crashes that I felt compelled to finish. But nonetheless, those are the ones that sort of failed to meet my expectations most jarringly. Let's put it that way. And then we've got the most surprising books. These actually were all audio books, which is I think more of a coincidence than anything else. So the first of them were I read fairly early on in the year was Nick Scrimger's Waystation Trilogy, I think it is. And I really enjoyed that. It's a sort of self-pubbed, but books are certainly not traditionally published, from a few years back, and N.C. Scrimger, as she's sort of formally known as, from an authorly point of view, is still busy publishing books. I think her most recent stuff has been sort of more fantasy than science fiction, and these are space opera sort of fare, and I really enjoyed them. I had fun. The characters were engaging, the setting was good. There were lots of political factions, and there was a sort of a deep past that was hinted at and then explored a little bit more as the books progressed. And there were, an alien menace and lots of sort of found family vibes, which I really enjoyed. So those were pretty good. And along similar lines, actually, I had heard this was good, so maybe this wasn't as big a surprise, but I was still surprised by how much I enjoyed it. It wasn't like smashed it out of the park, 10 out of 10 or anything, but I had fun listening to it. It was Simon R. Green's Death Stalker, which is sort of space opera for fans of Star Wars, is the best way that I can describe it. It's ripped off shamelessly a bunch of things from Dune and from Star Wars and from elsewhere. And it's got the author's British, and there's a little bit shades of Douglas Adams' sense of humour to it. Maybe it's not like laugh out loud funny, but there's a sort of sarcastic overtone to some of the dialogue and some of the internal dialogue that's on the page, or in my ear in this case, as I listened to it in audiobook. So that was good. That was a surprise, definitely worth a read. There are many more books that follow that first one. Which if I see out in the wild, I'll certainly grab, and one of these days I might even fork out to listen to them on audiobook. And then another one which I only read because it was in my list of sort of free stuff that I could listen to within my Audible subscription, rather than any particular recommendation, and I saw it and thought it was interesting enough, was The Quantum Magician by Derek Kunsken. And again, I really enjoyed the setting. This is a space opera again. I think it was mostly set in the solar system, but sort of future solar system, several hundred years in the future, and they sort of extrapolated from the nation states of today into what groupings might there be in the medium to far future. And there are sort of engineered humans. There are brainiac kind of human computers, sort of Mentat-like characters, and there are something called the I can't remember now what they're called, but there was a sort of a race, for want of a better word, of kind of knee-high or maybe waist-high people who were genetically engineered at some point in the past to be the slaves of some other religious faction, and these I wish I could remember what they were called. I have to put it on the screen. These funny individuals are sort of waist high. Have developed a religion of their own, and now venerate the people that they were meant to be slaves to, but in fairly sort of terminal fashion for their former slaves. And then they have holy scriptures, which are really anything but. They're the sort of instruction manuals and God knows what else. But they're I really enjoyed that particular thread in the book. So. The Quantum Magician, it's the first of a trilogy. There are another two, but it's essentially a heist. It's like I think I described it in my review as Ocean's 11 in space. Quite a lot of the first third of the book is taken up with gathering the kind of crew together, and they're a mixture of all of these various factions, and then the heist itself. And I enjoyed the way that he revealed. Or appeared to reveal sort of layers of the con that the main character Belisarius has put together. What you think is the reveal ends up not being the reveal, and it's pretty well done. So that was fun. I enjoyed it. That was a pleasant surprise. I got a special category all on its own for the oddest book of the first half of 2025 is The Carpet Makers by Andreas Eschbach. And the premise for the story is the oddest thing about it, and it just gets odder and odder as time goes in. So the setup for this is, as it's described on the inside cover, is since the time of prehistory, carpet makers have tied intricate knots to form carpets for the court of the emperor. These carpets are made from the hair of their wives and daughters, of which they have many. They're so detailed and fragile that each carpet maker finishes only one single carpet in his entire lifetime, and the art then passes from father to son since the beginning of time itself. So this is a very long established routine, and so you're immediately asking, what the hell are these carpets for? And there's a whole interstellar trade in them, and agents of the emperor come and pay for these carpets when they're ready, and it gets revealed. It starts small, so we start with one family, one carpet weaver and his son, and the family relationship, and the selling of his carpet, and the passing of that fortune to his son and his wife and daughters as they arrive. And then it expands, and you realise that the entire economy of the town is based on these flipping hair carpets, and then the entire planet, and then you realise that there's more planets than that. And the obvious question then is, what are all these carpets for? Why does the emperor need so many carpets? And it's definitely not for his palace, because there would be, the palace would be full in all three dimensions of carpet by now. So it's not for his palace. Nobody who's been to his palace can remember seeing carpets there. So where the hell what's the emperor doing with all of these carpets? And why has he bent the entire interstellar economy to be entire? It's like being on a war economy. The total economy is based around these carpets. And why? So it's a very strange book, and the reasons why are revealed as the book progresses, and that's a pretty good gut punch, actually. A bit of a strange surprise when you get to another odd aspect of the book, but pretty odd book. I enjoyed it. It was published quite some time back now. I forget when exactly. 1995. Yeah, so it's been around for like 30 years, and it was translated 20 years ago into English. And it's the titles you can see. I think in the US it's called Carpet Weavers or something like that. In the UK it's the Carpet Makers. So that was my oddest read of 2025 so far. Let's see, in reverse order, the top 5 or 6 books for this year. I suppose the ones that would be contenders for Book of the Year, and or contenders to appear in the top 10 or 15 for 2025 when we get there. Unless the second half, of course, of 2025 is even better than the first half, in which case, they may not. The first of these is A Dream of Wessix by Christopher Priest. It's a relatively slender book. One of his earlier books from, I think it's mid to late 70s, let's see, 77. And this is a sort of, as the name suggests, a sort of dreamy sort of tale of virtual realities. And then asking questions about what's real and what's virtual, and are there nested realities? Might there be a way? So there's a way of projecting consciousness into this dream state, into this virtual world which has been created. And in the real world, or is it the real world, there have been, climate change is a thing, and there have been earthquakes and floods, and the shape of the south of England is quite different to how it is now, and the sea's in a different place, and some of that's described in this book, which is quite interesting. And then the virtual world, people are projected there, but it's so convincing that they sort of forget while they're there that they had a life, relationships or whatever in the real world. we begin to wonder whether that was in fact the real world. And then in the projected world, then there's towards the end of the book some crazy stuff about people being projected onwards from there into more and more different versions of our world. It's a very interesting book, and I like Christopher Priest's writing. I've read a few of his books now, but by no means all of them, probably maybe a quarter, and I haven't read a Duff one yet, and this one I thought was pretty good too. Next in the top handful that I've read this year as a sort of double bill, I read them fairly close to each other, is Kite World by Keith Roberts and Pavane, of course, by Keith Roberts, probably the one that he's best known for. And I think I gave them both a 9 out of 10. I couldn't split the difference between them really, and in some respects they're quite different. One of them, Kite World, is set in a far future, almost a sort of fantasy version of Britain, where something in the past, either a nuclear war or some kind of plague or a combination of the two, has isolated villages and towns in England, and each of them has an entire cadre of people whose job it is to fly these enormous kites, and the kites are highly mechanical, and Keith Roberts goes into, and he does a similar thing in Pavane actually, only with traction engines instead. And I think Keith Roberts was a bit of a tinkerer himself, and so there's quite a lot of know-how from a engineering and technical point of view that goes into these books, both Kite World and Pavane. What I liked about both of them was a sort of slight sense of melancholia, a different version of England. In Pavane, it's an alternate history really, and we're in a world where Queen Elizabeth I was assassinated, whenever that was, in the 1600s or whenever, and the Protestant Reformation therefore never happened. The Spanish Armada was successful and invaded south of England, and the Pope's in charge. England's Catholic again, and it's quite a robust form of Catholicism, complete with the Spanish Inquisition, or the English Inquisition, I suppose. The Inquisition anyway. And it's episodic. Both of them are actually. Kite World is 2. Each of the chapters is like a little vignette of life in this world. So there are recurring characters, would be too strong a word. More like a connecting thread through them, as somebody's wife or mother or husband or brother or somebody that they knew in their past. It appears in one or more of the later vignettes. This is the UK first edition of Pavane, and it is missing, by the time this was published, later versions of this book have another story. I think it's The White Boat, which is not in the original version, which I haven't yet read. But I love them. I like his style of writing. I've read a few things by him now, and these both worked really well for me. And if you haven't read them, definitely worth giving them a crack. Another contender for my top 10 of the year when we get there is The Sea and Summer by George Turner. And this is another book that was on the Borwick and the Filippo 101 best novels list, which covers the period 1985 to 2010, if I remember rightly, 25 years. And this is set in a sort of post-climate change Australia. It's written in the 1990s, so sort of 1987 actually, I beg your pardon. And George Turner's an Australian author. It's set in Melbourne, in a Melbourne which is flooding, and to the point where tower blocks, lower floors of tower blocks are submerged. And in this book, Turner imagines a world in which there are the usual haves and have-nots. The sweet, the haves, and the swill are the have-nots. And then people that are haves are sort of perpetually terrified of losing what they have, and it's more and more precarious as each year progresses, and sliding into swilldom, where the great, literally the great unwashed, live in poverty on a state dole, a handout. So it's a lovely piece of world building. The character work's really good. There's an interesting framing device that the book opens with. It's like a far future, almost like an archaeological dig or a historical expedition into the sort of remaining kind of collapsed stumps of the tower blocks that feature in the story proper. And somebody, one of these future historians, has written a novel based on the bits and pieces of information they've been able to collect about life before the flood really got started. And that's really what forms the novel. That manuscript is what forms the basis of the novel. And we get 2 or 3 sort of interstitial bits from that future historian's kind of world, which is even more different than this one. But most of the book is set in the mid 21st century, something like that, where climate change, where the impacts of climate change are real and close up and personal. What I really liked was his style of writing, and I liked the characters, and I liked the setting. It was really well done. Something that I expect to be close to the top of the pile at the end of the year is Embassy Town by China Miéville, of course, and this is a tale of communication or miscommunication, really, with aliens. And we're with a small human enclave on the world of these aliens, and there are ambassadors and that are tasked with trying to communicate with the aliens, and we don't really understand them, they don't really understand us. And then something happens, somebody tries to shortcut that communication process and sort of manufacture or something that isn't the prescribed method anyway of creating an ambassador. And they speak, and it has an absolutely horrific effect on the aliens. It effectively turns them into it's not that they're like heroin addicts, is that there's no drug involved, but the effect on their brain is similar. When they hear this person speak, they go a little bit crazy, they can't get enough of it, and their whole society falls apart. And because the human enclave is almost entirely dependent for food and water and other supplies, and vitamins and what have you, they also are in a state of collapse. And so it's that story, and about trying to regain some control, both within the aliens and within the human enclave, and some common sense breaking out ultimately. But a really, really interesting read. His trademark style. And then my favourite read of the year, the only 10 out of 10 that I've doled out this year. I don't give out 10 out of 10s, nines and sometimes a 9.5, sure, but rarely a 10. I think I only did one last year. So this came out the gate pretty early on. I forget exactly when I read it, around March time, I think. And this is the Yiddish Policemans Union. This is another book that's on the Broderick and DeFilippo list. The author is Michael Chabon, and this is also an alternate history. It's set in a world in which the state of Israel never really got off the ground, and the European Jews, instead of migrating en masse to Israel in the aftermath of the Second World War and the Holocaust and the death of millions, of course, instead of migrating to or emigrating to Israel, they're offered some land in Alaska, on the coast in chilly old Alaska, to be a Jewish homeland. But it's a short-term rental, or it's a fixed-term rent. It's not short-term; it's decades. And this book is set in the early 2000s and 2010ish, that sort of time. And the lease on Sitka, which is the small, was a fishing village at the time that the land was granted. It's now quite a thriving city. That lease is up for is going to end. So there's no renewals. That's it. You find somewhere else to live now, chaps. And a little bit like the arrangement that Hong Kong, the Britain had with China for Hong Kong. Once the lease was up, it was like a 100+ year lease. But once the lease was up, it was handed back to China. And so it's going to be handed back to the US and back to the state of Alaska. And so there's that undercurrent of, what's going to happen to me, my family, the Jewish people on the move again, what's going on. So there's that sort of angst and sort of existential threat. And then, but it's mainly a police procedural. There's a sort of washed-up detective who's a bit of a drunk. He and his wife have split up, and he's feeling a bit miserable. He's living in sort of pretty low-rent digs, and but one day he's woken up because there's been a murder. One of his fellow residents in this kind of low-rent block has been killed, shot in the head, and he's a police detective, so obviously they go to him first. He starts to unravel this case, and he pulls at some threads, and some very powerful people are on the other end of those threads, and they really don't want him to pull them. And so there are a bunch of things to like in this book. The police procedural element of it's interesting, and there is a case to unravel and to solve, and that part of it's good, but it's by no means the best thing. I really enjoyed Chabon's writing. He's got a very kind of painterly touch in his writing. I thought that his prose was excellent, very lyrical. And very fulsome, not difficult to read at all. It wasn't clever or anything like that, but he's he's a Pulitzer Prize winning author, and it shows, I guess is what I'm saying. And the other things that were interesting were just the world building, if you like it. The sort of Jewish city of Sitka has layers and different branches of Jewry. There's lots of organised crime, as well as ordinary people getting on with their lives. and then there's Orthodox Jews and even more Orthodox Jews, and the sort of constraints that puts on life, and a lot of sort of Yiddish language and terminology that I didn't know anything about. And you got some clues from the context of the text, but I was a frequent Googler of terms to get some sense of what was being spoken about. So I love I like the sights and smells of it. You know, sometimes you get a really vivid picture of what the place is like. I felt that from reading this, and the story comes to a very neat conclusion at the end, which is satisfying too. So that's my favourite book of the year so far. And I fully expect it to appear quite near the top of the heap, if not the top, when I come to do my review of the full year of 2025's reading.